Thanks, guys. Let's just dive right in. A lot of my background really lends to having lived, a long life in IT and development and sysadmin and networking and SOC life. So now, fast forward to today, in terms of more sophisticated attacks against target entities, and one of which is the supply chain vehicle, right? And so what we're going to talk about today is an approach that leverages a risk-centric approach for building a threat model against, you name it. If you're part of an organization, you really have a flagship application, if you have a line of business, and you want to be able to understand what are the supply chain dependencies that you have that you maybe haven't factored into your threat model, this is what we're talking about today, is to build an offensive threat model that thinks more criminalistically, if you will, against your own application, your own environment, your own business. So just defining supply chain, there's a lot of things that really translate to supply chain. There's obviously, from a technology sense, we have software, we have embedded components, compiled binaries, compiled code, we have code off the shelf. There's a lot of different things, but what we also need to consider services. And recently, in the news, everyone's heard about the Nord VPN hack, and there's some service-related components there that they were sleeping on that allow them to be in the situation they're in. And I think this is a common situation that we're going to see more and more, because as organizations close the front doors, so to speak, on their application environments, you got to think about, as a criminal, you got to think about those side doors or other ways in to basically have more of a sophisticated way into the environment, maybe for a longer term play, attack play that's a little bit more sophisticated in nature. And we're gonna go through an example with one of the major infrastructure players in the United States in a moment. Now, for those of you who are familiar, either from a consumer side or maybe as an employee or maybe as a manager, operations. Let's take a look at this, figure here of an operational model. And, as an operations, first of all, I talked earlier on about a risk-centric approach. And let me just quickly define that risk is a result of threat times the probability of that threat times a weakness times a level of impact over a sense of a countermeasure, or something to withstand some of the negative aspects of an attack pattern or something like that. So when we talk about risk, we have to understand impact and weakness and vulnerability and threat motives and probability. Otherwise, we're just unilaterally just using one thing like a weakness and we carry that weakness and say we have a problem here, when you don't factor in things like probability and stuff like that. So let's look at an example here of an operations center. Though you could, in this fictitious example, in order to do a risk-centric threat model, you might have someone that is trying to understand, you want to understand what is the impact that this operational center has in terms of as a pain point. You even want to do that as a criminal. You want to do that as an offensive adversarial actor because, for different reasons. For example, let's say that we're all dissidents of a company, we're angry at a company for whatever reason, and we want to hit them where it hurts, right? It's a tactical plan to do that. So you want to be able to understand what are the high impact scenarios for that operations, whether it be an application or a broader set of operations. So you have someone here that says, hey, I'm kind of concerned about some of the information that we manage in this operational model, and I want to make sure, I don't know if we really are keeping our stuff secure. And then from a continuity side, supply chain, if you think about like Walmart, if you think about like Amazon, if you think about other major retailers, global players, or even like human resource service models like Capgemini, right? That's a supply chain aspect. They're involved in so many different types of business process outsourcing. You want to think about availability. availability of not just services, but also humans. What about if you have to consider things like pandemics or deliberate types of advanced attacks against humans, terrorist attacks and stuff like that. So that basically factors in the impact assessment approach, right? It factors in like where do we want to hit our target? What's going to make them hurt? From a defensive side, when we're looking at threat models, here's a common question, and this is the question that actually got ignored, is like, what is my attack surface, right? And the details around that, which has been made public, is that there's disparate infrastructure worldwide that particular B2C company had, and they basically had some infrastructure that was run by a third party, and it was poorly managed and run. And so understanding your attack surface of locations, of networks, of components, as we look at the shaded background here, this is an operations center where you have shipping trucks pull up. There's scanner guns, that you have Wi-Fi networks, you have local servers that are basically maybe like printing labels, maybe that has a local database of personal information. So as we're exploring this idea of an offensive threat model, we need to look at this environment in a more criminalistic sense. It's like, what do I want to get out of this? Do I want to make sure that that I hit them where it hurts, as it relates to their service delivery, maybe availability, or do I want to compromise some of their data? Obviously, the inherent issue of security. This guy who's maybe the IT admin, who maybe has some concerns about the attack surface, is trying to understand not only what do I run, but what is the inherent configuration of the systems and network services and technology that I'm using. So from a supply chain standpoint, there's the easy low-hanging fruit of default anything, right? I've been to a lot of different, let's talk about healthcare for a second. A lot of healthcare organizations outsource their IT, right? You're talking about healthcare systems, hospital systems. And so you have an aspect of, you have IT service providers that are configuring, managing everything from towers to laptops, but also equipment. So all these things have credentials, all these things have services, all these things could be reached by some rogue actor on the network. So again, we're getting this offensive threat model mentality in play. And obviously the thing relates also to the architecture. Do we have a flat architecture? We want to consider all these things when we're doing an offensive threat model, because as we introduce this kind of proverbial looking shady character into the picture, the right way to do an offensive threat model is to think from a criminal standpoint. And the reason I say that's the right way of doing it is because if you don't ask yourself the question, what am I protecting and who is likely to get in, then your threat model could just be a kind of a conversation that encompasses threats that don't have the threat evidence to support it in the industry that you're in, and the type of information that you manage, the type of vertical market that you're in, and other factors. So the good thing about threat modeling is that it can envelope a lot of these other activities that we normally do as security professionals: application pen testing, validating third-party applications before they're introduced into a network, vulnerability scans, etc. But the idea with what we're talking about today is to really push this notion of thinking. There's a lot of different threats to consider. What are the ones that have threat motives that are supported by research? And also let's understand what is the likelihood of these threats happening to your organization. Because otherwise, from experience, this is what we commonly see, is that you see that a lot of fear mongering, right? I don't know, maybe you guys have seen that security professional that anything there's a new vulnerability, a new zero day that comes out, they're like, this is what we have to do, and they're basically inside an organization of like a Fortune 1000, and they're saying, we got to do this, we have this technology in place, and we got to patch it now. And they lose sight of this, and they lose sight of the motives, they lose sight of the probabilistic analysis. because they don't understand the attack vector. They don't understand their criminal intent. They don't understand what is the overall threat motive that really propels a sophisticated threat actor to really want to compromise an application or a business. Speaking of impact, oftentimes in security over the past, 15, 20 years, I've been doing IT and IS. Security professionals, we don't really have a good background in really determining impact, right? Our way of determining impact is if the POC of our exploit works. If we basically got a shell, or we basically were able to pull back data from a relational database over the web through SQL injection or something like that, then that's enough right there, and we stop there. But what we don't know oftentimes is the value of that information, the value of uptime. And so we have to think from a risk-centric approach, if you're employing this technique, these types of considerations, right? Because I've literally seen security professionals go up to a leader and say, hey, if we don't do this, you're going to get, this cluster of web servers are going to get compromised. And then, a business person or a product person might say, well, why do I care? Why do I care? And someone else has to really kind of do the math and say, well, downtime, this will only be down for right now, it would be down for 8 hours. And maybe 8 hours is nothing to them, compared to the amount of effort to remediate, right? And so the reality is, as we see hacks du jour, breaches du jour every week, whether it be, Nord or anyone else, we're seeing that, businesses are kind of rolling the dice. They're rolling the dice on security, they're rolling the dice on privacy. But we have to understand when we're doing a risk-centric threat model, what is the ultimate impact, right? And so let's take a look at a key step in building a threat model. And I like to ask the question, the name threat model has that keyword name threat, right? And so, I like to always ask a threat modeler or someone like a security champion that's doing threat modeling, what is your list of threats? And for me, I always kind of get surprised about how they don't consider what their application does in the broader context of the business, to the broader context of the market that they're in. And so it's important to build a threat library that coincides with those things. What information are you managing? What is your deployment model? Who are your supply chain vendors that are supporting your infrastructure? Do you have people, processes, and technology that are third or fourth or fifth parties that are involved? Do you know what they do? Do you know what access do they have? The issue with going back to Nord was a remote access issue, poor credentialing from a very small IT shop in Northern Europe. And there wasn't any sort of vetting because as security professionals, we look at the bigger attack surface of things, but we don't think about the supply chain factor, which is now an evolving topic in our industry. Along with a threat library that you can come up with through research and through also kind of pulling some key figures within that maybe support the application, developers actually have a really good understanding about how they would actually attack their own application. Because they deal with the information their application is managing. It's good to just simply say, what would you do with this, with what this application does? Or if you wanted to bring it down, or if you wanted to steal information, how would you go about doing it? So it's important to correlate a threat library, which is really easy to do. It's kind of like a brainstorming exercise with threat motives. And we'll see why in a second. That second has arrived. We are going to look in the next couple of slides on threat sources and threat intel, and the one thing that's missing here is threat data. Now, threat intel I characterize as information that you get from experts that are doing threat or risk analysis at a global level for different types of industries. In this case, we see the World Economic Forum really release this analysis on macro geopolitical risk issues. Now, supply chain attacks are a little bit more sophisticated than your, very kind of sniper-related attacks that are looking for fun and profit on information compromise, IP theft, and stuff like that. You may still do a supply chain attack for those types of goals. Absolutely. You may want to basically, insert a component of something malicious in a broader application or a broader appliance or product for the purposes of IP theft, absolutely. But when we're looking at this here, and I apologize for the faintness of the graph, is look at the purple, the orange, and the blue. In simple terms, the purple really relates to more technological types of risks that have been, assessed and evaluated as top risks for organizations from the World Economic Forum. Now, this day and age, there's a lot of interesting geopolitical issues that are happening worldwide, not only in this country, but abroad as it relates to trade, as it relates to economic development of different economies in Africa and South America, currency backing, currency hedging, influencing financial markets. All of these things, if you think about the right supply chain attack, to the right target entity, New York Stock Exchange, some sort of like major impactful company like even Amazon or some transportation, Department of Transportation, health services, anything that's critical or that provides a meaningful impact to economies, then you're going to basically need a more sophisticated hack, of which you need to consider how does geopolitical risk factors translate to more sophisticated supply chain attacks. This is from the World Economic Forum. This one's from the Global Risk Interconnections report that came out in 2019. And the thing to highlight here are kind of the boldness of different lines. And again, focus on the purple, the orange, and the blue here. And what's interesting is, some obvious things, cyber attacks as it relates to an increase in concern to critical infrastructure, which is really topical to, supply chains. With the example we're going to look at, which I'm going to basically talk on the U.S. Postal Service. So some of the lines connecting the relationships of these diamonds here. Let's take a look at profound social instability. You look at cyber attacks, and it's connected to some of these other diamonds with different degrees of density of the line. But for supply chain attacks, especially let's go back to the operational center. Let's say I'm a mastermind for a hacker syndicate employed by a nation state. Then I want to be able to establish repudiation. I think I had it in the prior slide. And you want to get a lot of foot soldiers. If there is a profound social instability in a region, in a country, in a region within a country, maybe within an industry that allows for recruitment, that allows for collusion, that allows for propagation of or intelligence gathering, OSINT from within. All these things help to the criminal in an offensive threat model to basically understand information that they need in order to introduce their supply chain attack. The reason we're talking about all these different reports, here's another report. This is really interesting, looking at the past 10 years. You look at 2009 to 2019. What's really interesting with this, and I know you can't see it in the back there, but these are kind of the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood. And if you look at here, 2007 there was a pretty bad economic recession globally, and it was equally, or it was pretty bad in the United States as well. So you see a lot of things that are financially related: fiscal crisis, asset price collapse 1 and 2 in 2009, 2010. As the years goes by, you look at the green, right? We're almost at 2020. The environment is a big topic, right? Fires and kind of unpredictable weather, which affects distribution, which affects shipping, which affects, transportation, you name it, manufacturing, farming, the list goes on. All these things, by the way, affects economics. So from a kind of more roping in geopolitical risk factors to, how that can that can be manipulated by a nation state with the right actors through supply chain is very feasible. You see cyber purple pop up here 2018, 2014, 2012, it starts to basically make the top 5. And so the point with the last 3 slides is when you're doing threat modeling, it's important to have the background of what the threat landscape is. And it doesn't really take a lot to research that. And yeah, My opening statement was like, I dream of bankrupting the security industry with greater automation and, you know, artificial intelligence, stuff like that. There's a lot that you can do with correlation of data. There's a lot you can do with, you know, aggregating massive amounts of data to do regression analysis and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, if you want to be a really good threat modeler, it's really trying to understand, and you're working for a multinational company, then it's really important to understand where you fit and how geopolitical risk factors affect you. Just to wrap up there on the threat intelligence side, these are obviously more geopolitical risk threat intelligence. This is not your typical APT-41 or APT-3 type of threat intelligence that you might get from like a Mandiant or whatever. But you know, here's just additional, you know, things that as you're building out your threat library, you know, and let's say that you are in manufacturing, let's say that you are in, you know, transportation. You know, you want to be able to kind of consider what are some of the barometers or what are some of the things that globally other major companies, players, governments are seeing, because that should factor into your mindset when you're building an offensive threat model. All right. I promised a sample threat model overview with the U.S. Postal Service, and here it is. Some fun facts about the U.S. Postal Service is that it basically handles more mail than any other postal service system in the world. Retail network is larger than McDonald's, Starbucks, and Walmart combined, which is really interesting. And it's traditionally the last provider of last mile delivery, which basically means like even players like Amazon are using the U.S. Postal Service to do that last mile delivery. So, you know, as we think about a threat model for them, you know, one of the natural things is relates to continuity. You know, the Postal Service, sure, has information on citizens. It might have, obviously, continuity. The continuity of it delivering its services affects the companies like Walmart, like Amazon, like Target that are using it for last mile delivery. It also, you know, affects, you know, government services. How much does the government, state, municipalities use the U.S. Postal Service to send, you know, different types of government documents? So there's a lot of things that pass through the U.S. You know, Postal Service, and you know, I mentioned two particular types of threats that, you know, should be in a threat library. You know, one is related to affecting the continuity of it, maybe through a type of sabotage attack, maybe through a type of extortion play. The U.S. government, you know, the U.S. Postal Service is autonomous outside of the U.S. government, but they have money to spare if they're in a situation where some of their key systems are all simultaneously bricked, or components within those systems are bricked and they don't have the redundancy. And downtime in days could equate to, you know, some level of financial loss and an actual economic impact for some of its own customers. So that's just playing off of the extortion play, which is one of the threats that have been super hot, you know, over the past couple of years with multiple different vertical markets. So I like to basically have this overview. When I do a threat model, this really kind of captures, you know, what is the attack surface? And you can get, if you're doing an application threat model, you can get as granular as you want. You can basically make these to be an enumerated list of API endpoints, maybe of different daemons that are running that are key, maybe different batch jobs that are super important, server-side operations, you know, you name it. So let's talk about some of the components of the U.S. Postal Service. Now, I'm going to talk about two. One is the delivery bar mail sorters. And these mail sorters, and if you have, I don't know if you remember, I had the benefit of taking a tour of some of these facilities, and they're quite impressive. I mean, they're like much bigger than a football field, and you have these massive machines that are just pumping through, you know, different parcels, catalogs, 8 by 11, you know, all boxes and everything, and then all systematically, you have these sorters to basically sort where things go, you know, and it's amazing. What's really amazing is that you have this downtime requirement. If something stops, you have 10 minutes before you go to the next sub level, and so you know, here is the kind of a blueprint of one of their other kind of products that they use. It's called the Advanced Facer Cancellation System. It's a pretty fancy name, and it's capable of processing 30,000 pieces of mail per hour. Like I said, you know, they have an escalated downtime of 10 minutes. I mean, this system here is much bigger than this room, And it basically has all these moving parts, chutes and rollers and all these different things. And they have these PLM boards that basically, there's embedded programming into these boards, and that's where the supply chain consideration can come in, obviously, right? Because they, and like most other operational places similar to them in terms of warehouse operations, they're not taking the time to vet that third party that is providing the hardware that has that code base. So from an offensive standpoint, thinking about what is the possibility of being able to affect the supply chain to those providers of these types of systems, and being able to have a concerted attack that's time-based that affects a major distribution center. And so that's the concerted effort where even you could do this across multiple different distribution facilities and really impact mail distribution regionally, at least through the southeast or the northeast, et cetera. Now, obviously, that the goal in doing that is, let me get my hands on one of these boards, which is not hard. Let me actually understand the code base, which also might not be hard if you're able to reverse it or even get the source from the manufacturer. There's many ways to do that through social engineering of the company, because they want to exemplify how good their code is or whatever. They want to be able to answer any sort of bogus security questions related to the code base, and so therefore they cough up more than they really need to. But the traditional aspect of just simply doing VR, vulnerability research, on compiled binaries and doing the reversing and seeing if there's some sort of way to do a command injection and then package it up and then introduce it back to the vendor for the U.S. Postal Service. What is one of the easiest ways to introduce tainted materials or components is price discounting. So if you're really a smart adversarial individual or group or entity, you simply have an exact looking product, you put your malicious payload after you've basically decompiled, reversed, and then infiltrated the code base and repackaged, and you offer it at a complete discount. And your end goal is really not to make money on that supply chain aspect. Your end goal is the extortion play, where basically you're holding the keys to bouncing back with the U.S. Postal Service and saying, here's the corrected issue, if you want to basically get back and running within X amount of time. What's helpful in doing these types of exercises is building attack trees. I like attack trees. Some people like kill chains simply because you build your threat library that we had earlier on the presentation, and then for each threat that you have in your library, you can build a tree. And the idea in a risk-centric approach is that you can take this as far down in multiple levels, is that you basically, how would sabotage happen for a target application, a target system, and how would that be realized? And so you basically look at, well, what are the targets? Obviously, you don't want to target a component that is going to not affect continuity of business. That would be pretty worthless in terms of a strategy. So you want to define now we're thinking more, if we're all working for an organization, we need to understand obviously our attack surface, our targets, and we need to see what sort of associated vulnerabilities or weaknesses are associated with those components, and then see what the viability is of different attack patterns against those weaknesses that have been identified. And so what this does, what the threat model does, is it basically embellishes activities that already happen in most places. Right here, this is your pen testing, and the attack modeling, the attack vector viability analysis, just fancy talk for exploitation testing, right? Pen testing. And so this sees if something is viable. It builds off of obviously the vulnerabilities that were detected to see if those vulnerabilities that were found, that were qualified, were actually can actually be successfully exploited. The good thing about this tree is that these attacks are supposed to support the goal of the sabotage, which is the threat that's in your threat library. And this is really rational for sharing with different people in operations and IT operations that are basically responsible for applications and systems, because it provides a very logical kind of domino effect. So the impact is very clear, and the path of concern is also very clear. So from a kind of adversarial viewpoint here, we want to think about what is our objective from a criminal sense. Do we want to steal data? Do we want to do intellectual property theft? And then we basically, we pick our targets. Here's a Pitney Bowes product that is also very embedded in many warehouse components. There's Honeywell, which has multiple different types of products that it has for modern day warehouse operations, with multiple different types of interfaces, from the handsets that are, communicating over Bluetooth or NFC to other systems. So the understanding the target selection as the offensive, individual is really important as we're going through this exercise. Understand who are the manufacturers that are in play that you want to hit. So a lot of intel, this is actually a lot easier than it seems, even from a purely black box perspective, because oftentimes as a cyber criminal, or even as just a kind of a black hat doing an engagement, a lot of the suppliers are actually pretty chatty about who they're in bed with, And so all these different people that are quoted here are pretty easy to, this one's actually with the municipality right here, or a school system. Here's the Department of Revenue for the state of Mississippi. So you begin to see who's advertising their use of a particular component that maybe you've actually paid $100,000 for a 0-day on, and it's something that relates to a component, and you just want to basically say, where does this component fit in my global set of possible targets? And so if you basically are, again, this is for the criminal, group, if you're basically out there and you're buying up 0 days and you want to weaponize them, you want to be able to shop around and see, where do I weaponize this against? This is a tool that we built, is also from a defensive standpoint. It basically aggregates a lot of things that are out there just to kind of understand the attack surface, exposed APIs, hardware components, different types of human operators as targets as well, in order to do collusion, in order to do different types of perpetration, for different types of targeted social engineering campaigns. And this, from the geopolitical risk standpoint, you better believe that that there are syndicates and nation states that are employing these types of techniques on a regular basis. So this is really nothing new for anybody. But what it is new is trying to basically put this all into an offensive threat model, right? Is an offensive threat model where you can exercise this. One of the things about going back to the U.S. Postal Service and other types of operations such as that, warehouse operations, is that there's an implicit trust model that exists between components. Not only software components, but the components that are related to third and fourth parties or code off the shelf or appliances. And any good IT person gone bad, hence the black spy versus spy character there, would be very knowledgeable of that. And so abusing that implicit trust model is already an inherent kind of low-hanging fruit or gimme, if you will, for the adversary. Here we just see some data flows between controller, an HMI component, and some of the an IPC process, and understanding. I'm providing this example because most of the examples I've provided have been a little bit less on the embedded component or the application side. This is more of if you have one application and you see that it has different components in it, you want to be able to understand how is your communication. Typically there's some sort of acknowledgement. It's very simple communication, but you want to be able to understand the trust model between these components. All right, so we've talked about motive. We've talked about understanding attack surface. We've talked about using different types of threat intelligence to kind of substantiate a threat library. Now it comes times to really kind of establishing credibility on certain types of threats. And like I said, there's the U.S. Postal Service has actually been in the news and has had incidents before. So here's one from 2018. U.S. Postal Service site exposed data for 60 million users. They have this fairly new, it's a couple years old, product or application called informed delivery. It's been dubbed a stalker's dream. So it's basically a web-based application, and it allows for from an adversarial person to really kind of find out massive amounts of personal information for those that are in the USPS system. But these things have been in the news and in the past. And so from a threat modeling perspective, if you have incidents or if you have intel, it helps to basically substantiate what's in your threat library. That's the point of really making sure that when you build a threat library, you sustain it with evidence, with research. Now, let's talk about things from a defensive side, hence the white spy versus spy character, is a prescriptive guidance that you can do for using an offensive threat model from a defensive side, is that it builds context of what you should really focus on first, right? So, most operations in most businesses, they say, well, we need to have this, we need to have vulnerability management, we need to have a SOC, we need to have, a SIM and this, that, and the other, and they don't really think about the strategy of it, right? If you understand the context of threats that you face as an entity within an industry because of the data that you have, because of the architecture of your applications, because of the deployment model, because of your supply chain of your vendors and what they do, it adds context. And so with that, you can basically wrap your model to govern, understanding what is the attack surface that we need to know. And I mentioned different stages of PASTA. If you're interested in PASTA, just Google PASTA and threat modeling, and you'll find some sources and visual diagrams and stuff like that. It also helps from a white hat perspective to do abuse cases that fulfill threat objectives. Oftentimes, you might actually pay for someone to do a pen test, and they're just going to go full hog based upon what a framework might do. Metasploit says, or Canvas says, or Hailstorm says, or whatever. And that's not what criminals do. Criminals are thinking through what they want. Good criminals are thinking about how they want to get in and how they want to establish persistence, etc. So if persistence is a threat that you want to mitigate, then think about what are the components that architecturally don't have are most susceptible to fall into that. But all these different stages help to define, use a threat model to leverage what vulnerabilities to triage first, how the vulnerabilities relate to that attack surface so that you can build that customized tree, and then actually do the type of exploit testing that provides that variable in the risk equation, which is probabilistic analysis. There was a colleague of mine, I think he was in Minnesota or something like that. He had this product that basically what it did regression analysis on exploit testing. And he used the regression analysis to basically qualify the probability of a certain attack to being successful. And he sold the product for, I don't know, to who, Richard Searson, I think is his last name, but I worked with him on a DHS project actually. And it was really interesting because it helped to qualify the probability of a certain attack pattern against an application or against a system. But going back to leveraging a threat model and some prescriptive guidance is, there's things that, from a risk perspective, that go beyond just simply preemptive mitigation of vulns, reducing an attack surface, better architecture. There's things like understanding what is the business aspect of what the system or application does. There might be regulatory requirements that alone might be a business impact to consider. There might be legal requirements. And so if you look at the different stages, it kind of walks you through some considerations to leverage as part of a risk-centric approach. The final thoughts. Here's some final thoughts. I've always been a kind of a cynic with Gartner, and the reason I'm a cynic with Gartner, I have been, because there seems to be a lot of organizations that kind of live and die their security programs on what Gartner says, and I'm not criticizing that, but I just wanted to mention this because some people take credence to a lot of what the analysts say there, and this is actually a pretty decent one. Software and hardware-based supply chain attacks are trending up. This is no surprise to anyone. This is why you guys are probably interested in this talk. The difference is being able to not just run out the door and say supply chain, where do I start, but to kind of take a step back and form an opinion of a threat model, and then look at that threat model and apply it offensively against whatever your target is. Some of the risks that we're seeing that are escalating and changing. 2017 saw a dramatic rise in supply chain attacks over the previous year. That's 200% increase. So if you don't have supply chain attacks, and the components that your supply chain dependencies consist of, then it probably is worth consideration. Typical attacks cost 1.1 million. While physical attackers can hijack a truck, harm a driver, etc., there are attacks that might siphon on much more than money when they are discovered. The example I use there is that we see a lot of different cases in the forensic analysis that we do where it's IP theft. So startup in New York and even here in Austin or in Silicon Valley, there's nation states that their business plan literally is on IP compromise for the purposes of getting that sort of a competitive advantage, getting that same company to be basically launched from that particular country for economic development. So if you can steal someone else's IP, you're completely curtailing the biz dev cycle of the software, the engineering, the architecture, and if you're lucky, you can even get some revenues or target markets. You can discount and then you can go to market. So all that heavy work that a US company did is basically now being profited by a nation state that basically is looking to bolster their economic advancements, because any one idea could be a multi-billion-dollar industry for them, led by one player that leads to 5 other players. I'm going to skip this slide real quick, and I'm just going to dive into this and say, a lot of people use Stride, and this is my basically visual representation of Stride, because it hasn't evolved. It's a nice acronym to remember, to basically use. It makes it simple, but simple acronyms that are going to be static, that encompass a static list of threats: spoofing, tampering of data, repudiation, information disclosure, in a very dynamic and ever-changing threat landscape is pointless, in my opinion. But that's just why I think that a lot of people that use it are going to be ill-prepared and not thinking outside the box, because you better believe that criminals are very much thinking outside the box. This doesn't show well on a big screen, but there's basically this process for attack simulation and threat analysis was invented in 2015, and me and Marco Morana, who's an Italian native-born guy who was an SVP at Citigroup in London, we wanted to basically come up with a process that looked at things offensively from an offensive point of view, whether it be an application or an entity, and tried to basically use threat-based evidence that we see in the industry to be able to come up with defined threats, associated attacks that would realize those threats in a very linear methodology. And that's what basically the process for attack simulation and threat analysis is. It's the a risk-centric approach to threat modeling. There's a lot of inputs and outputs related to each stage. The great thing about it is that it's been covered by Carnegie Mellon, the U.S. CERT, various universities worldwide. HP has referenced it. There's a lot of tools that reference it as well. And so the main premise around it is that in security, there is a lot to cover. And there's probably a high chance that you're not going to cover all the angles. So focus on the things that are going to be of highest impact. And then it doesn't mean that you basically ignore the other things that are going to be less impactful, but it allows for you to focus. It allows for you to focus your activities in vuln management, in architecture, in exploitation, in vulnerability research to things that support a threat objective. The last thing I'll mention here is beyond just simply recommending risk-based approach is look into other different frameworks. Like I really like the STIX framework a lot. I know it hasn't been, there's about 50 or so companies that have their taxi servers and are really using STIX a lot. One of the things that we're doing is that we're actually trying to be the leader in one of the domains. Styx has 12 domains, and one of the domains that doesn't get a lot of showtime is the campaign domain. Now there's APT campaigns that Mandiant puts out, but some of the things that I mentioned from the Global Economic Forum, that as it relates to, like, what is to say that in 5-10 years we're not going to have a power play on water, right, as a natural resource? What about climate or environmental hacking for the purposes of creating environmental threats against an adversarial country? Because those sort of things, as we're seeing in California, cost a lot of time and money and livelihood and a lot of different things that really consumes a lot of resources for local and domestic resources within a country. So things are going to get pretty advanced really quick, and so in order to get information quickly, Styx provides a really good schema and set of criteria. It's well thought out. It's interlinking domains where you can look at indicators of compromise and how that is associated with vulnerabilities and how that's associated with different campaigns. It needs evolution, but it's something that we're actively using and working with other players that have already instantiated their own taxi services. You can, there's this service called Hail a Taxi. If you haven't heard of it, how many have heard of Hail a Taxi? There's, it's basically kind of a free threat exchange place. Obviously, places like FS-ISAC, they're reported to have abide by the latest Styx protocol. The unfortunate thing with Styx is that it used to be supported and really managed by MITRE a lot, but then it got forked over to Oasis. But there's still a global community and push to leveraging that. And I've talked to people like Richard Struess, who's kind of been the director in DHS over TAC. And I've talked to some of the people that work at MITRE, Bob Christie and Bob Martin, to be able to see in the past how can we basically encompass some of the things that that a lot of us use today, like vulnerabilities, and map it to some of the domains in Styx. If you have specific questions on risk-centric threat models, if you have any questions on the talk, please feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter.
Okay, well, as a token of our appreciation from LastCon, we'd like to present you with this gift.
Awesome, thank you, appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, guys.